Okay, the next principle that we're going to talk about is that the United States of America was to be a republic. And this is something that every single founder agreed on. We are not a democracy. So let's think of the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic, not the democracy, but to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. This is a huge pet peeve of mine. You hear democracy so much. We were watching a political debate recently with some friends, and one of the candidates kept saying, and of course, like so many politicians do, let's not talk about what I believe. I'm just going to point to that guy and say, he's a threat to our democracy. And I don't know how many times that came up. This person's a threat to our democracy. No, I'm not. You're a threat to the democracy. Stop calling it a democracy. We are not a democracy. And the founders were very careful to make sure we weren't a democracy. James Madison knew, and the founding fathers all knew, that there wasn't a single example in human history of a stable, peaceful, long-lasting democracy. James Madison said, democracies have ever been the spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. That's true. Go try and find a democracy that lasted a long time and was peaceful and was wonderful. The Greeks tried it, and other societies have tried it, but their ends were swift and they were violent. They did not last long. Now let's think about it. He makes two claims here, that in a democracy, there's no personal security, there's no personal safety, and there's no protection of property. So let's talk about why that is. Why is there no personal security? Why is there no personal protection? And the reason is, if you can get enough people to agree with you, you can have a majority. A mere 51% of the people can come together, pass any law they want, and oppress all the rest. If they want to pass a law that says every single one of that 49% has to leave their homes, give us all their stuff, and come serve us as slaves, then that becomes the law, and that has to happen. So you can imagine when people try to oppress those minorities, why these things might end violently. If someone tried that, it's not going to end pretty. And that's a little bit of an extreme example, but it illustrates the point. Why don't democracies then protect the right of property? Well, for the same reason, because the majority can come together and to say, we really like your land. We really like your business. You've done a great job building this thing up. We're going to pass a law that says that all redheads now have to give us their businesses because redheads tend to be really successful for some reason. So guess what? It's all ours. Thank you for the work. Have a nice day. Move on with your life. Democracies are mob rule. It's you get enough people together, you get the majority together, and they can do whatever the heck they want. And that kind of absolute power does corrupt, absolutely. And it has every single time so far. Now, there's another problem with democracy that were addressed in the Federalist Papers, and James Madison doesn't talk about it here, but they all saw this. A democracy was simply impractical for a country the size that America was at the time, with 13 colonies spanning all up and down the East Coast. But they were looking to the West, and they saw a future where a huge chunk of that westward land would become a part of the United States. And in a democracy, the way that you pass laws is every single citizen comes together and votes. So if you want to pass an ordinance at your town that limits the paint color that you can put on your house, every single person in the town has to show up. And this isn't just for local things. This goes all the way up to the federal level. So every single law, from federal to state to county to local, you need to research, you need to understand all of its ins and outs, and then you need to go and actually vote and do that yourself. And I don't know about you. We're in the middle of an election cycle right now, and it's about all I can do to research the handful of candidates I got to decide on. If I had to spend my time researching every single law that is passed, every ordinance, the millions of pages that have been passed as law in this country, a normal person, we simply don't have time to do that. At the federal, state, county, and local levels, we can't, it's simply not practical. It's not possible. You might get people just voting and they have no idea what they're voting for. So you get bad laws that haven't been really thoroughly thought through. Not to mention the fact that it's just really hard to tally up every time there's a federal vote on whatever the case is, to tally up to 300 million votes every single time just doesn't work. Now, a republic is what we are, and we're specifically a constitutional republic. So let's start with the republic piece of that first. So the republic piece solves the impracticality problem. So instead of all of us having to understand all the laws and go vote every single time an ordinance or any law of any size needs to be passed, we elect representatives who go and do that for us. So they can have their full-time job being, hopefully, they're reading the laws before they pass them so that we can focus on our lives, on growing food, on building things, on engineering, medicine, science, whatever the case is. So that solves the impracticality. We get to send delegates, they get to go do that work for us, and every so often through elections, we get to decide if we like what they're doing, or we can fire them if we don't and hire somebody else. But a republic itself doesn't necessarily, it's a method of representation and of voting, but a republic all by itself doesn't necessarily solve the problems of oppression and the problems of persecuting or hurting somebody or taking their stuff. Because you can still, hypothetically, it's a little bit harder because it's a layer removed. So ideally, you have representatives that can kind of resist some of the more base impulses of people to just take from other people. That layer of separation does help with that somewhat. But hypothetically, you still could have the majority of those representatives, if they're listening to the voice of the people, come and decide to oppress a minority. And this is where a constitutional republic has been such a game changer and was a novelty. Before this time, there wasn't a written constitution that we know of in the history of the world. And what made that so important was at the very end of the Constitution, there's an acknowledgement that everybody, every state and every person that lives under this Constitution acknowledges that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. It has the final say. So even if 70% of the people decide that they want to go take something from someone else, if the Constitution doesn't allow it, it doesn't matter if 70% of the people want it. The Constitution says no, the Constitution stops it. Now, if you can get 75% of all the states to agree to something, you can amend the Constitution, but that's a much higher bar to vault than a simple majority of 50.1% of the people. So it makes it a lot harder to go make those changes that could be oppressive. And the size of the United States, the fact that you have areas that are heavy on agriculture and others that are heavily reliant on industry and on manufacturing, and you've got other areas that are very heavily reliant on technology innovation, means you've got all these competing interests across a large continent. It's really hard to conceive of a scenario where you could get 75% of the people, when all of these competing interests across such a large continent are at play, where you get 75% that would be willing to come in and agree to oppress one group. Because chances are one of those oppressed groups is a large percentage in and of itself. So it was a really, really brilliant way of handling it. But the Constitution being there as a backstop to protect against those abuses, in addition to the layer of separation between the people and the laws that are being enacted, have gone a long way to solve the problems of a democracy. So anytime you hear, I hope from now on, anytime you hear someone say, we got to protect our democracy, you think like I do that, thank goodness we don't have a democracy. We are a constitutional republic, and that's the only reason that we are still here after almost 300 years. Okay, now as I'm going through this, some of you are probably thinking there's a blaring problem here that the Constitution has not protected all minorities from its inception. Slavery was a big, big topic during the Constitutional Convention, and I want to do a separate episode on just that at some point because it deserves its own podcast. I mean, you write books about this, but basically in the Constitutional Convention, the northern states wanted to abolish it completely once and for all. The southern states did not. They wanted their representation in the House of Representatives to be calculated based on the number of free and enslaved people. And so enslaved people would count as a whole person. Now, a lot of people look at this and say, oh my gosh, the founding fathers said that a slave is worth 3/5 of the person. No, that's not what it means. The 3/5 compromise was the North wanted to weaken the South and not allow any representation based on the number of slaves. It was only on free people. And the slave states wanted their representatives and the number of representatives they got for their state to be calculated based on the total number of free and enslaved people. So this was a compromise that was kind of, look, our country's going to fall apart. No one was really happy with it, but they agreed that for purposes of representation, they would count enslaved peoples as 3/5 of the person. So the slave states didn't get everything they wanted, but it did weaken their position in Congress considerably. So the Constitution, though, kind of enshrined that this oppression of slavery would continue. And that is truly unfortunate. And thank goodness that we have since fixed that through subsequent amendments. Slavery has been abolished. Equal rights to all people have been guaranteed under the Constitution. And we're still working on making sure that we achieve that as best as we can. And where we are today, and where most of the founders wanted to get to, including slaveholders like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. They wanted to get there a lot sooner than we did. But to the point where even if today the majority decided they wanted to take all property away from people with freckles, the Constitution prevents that from happening because that's there to protect some of those more not okay inclinations of people to want to take from those who have and give it to themselves.